Hey guys, it's Ryan here. So, this week, TestProject released a new version of their software, and it contained a number of new features. So, I thought I would put out a quick video exploring one of those new features, self-healing tests. So, before we look at TestProject, let's spend a moment understanding what we mean by self-healing tests. So traditional automation tests fail when the element required by a test cannot be found. When we're scripting a test, we usually provide a single locator for each element. That's usually expressed as an XPath, a CSS, selector, an ID, and so on. What happens is this results in a single point of failure. If for some reason the application changes and the locator becomes invalid, the test fails. So in itself, this is not a bad thing. If an application changes, as a tester, we want our automation test to identify that an application has changed and report back to us so we can investigate further. In contrast, a self-healing test records multiple locators for each element. It will attempt to find the element using the same locator each time, but if it's unsuccessful, it will iterate through the remaining stored locators to see if any of those work before it fails the test. If the test is able to proceed with another locator, it will do without failing. If none of the locators work, then the test will be marked as failed. Okay, so now we know a little bit more about self-healing tests, we can jump over to TestProject and see how it works there. So I've already created a project called self-healing test, and inside here we have a single test to register a user, and this test currently just has a single step to navigate to my application. I'm going to go into recorder mode to open up that application on our registration page, and from there we can fill in the fields and see how TestProject records and stores the locators. Okay, so I'll move it over to this screen so you can see. I'm just going to make sure we're recording, and I will just fill in this form here to register our user. Email address, password, and repeat password, and let's register that user. Great, so that's all the steps for our test. So now I'm going to drill down into one of these fields so we can see what's actually happening. So if I go to the email field here, for example, click in there, I can see that we have this elements section here. And at the moment, this is set to CSS selector as our locator. So if I click the little pencil here to edit this, I can actually see a full list of all the locators that TestProject has found to identify this single element of email. So these are all the locators that TestProject has found for the email field. However, if you wanted to, you can add additional locators. You can also delete them as well. So if there are locators that you don't want TestProject to use, you can get rid of them. You can also change the order. So TestProject is going to work through these in order from top to bottom until it finds one which works. So it's worth putting the most robust locator at the top of your list. For now, we'll keep it as it is. Before we see how the self-healing works, let's close this down and run this test again to make sure it works as it is. So let's run this test on Chrome against my application now. So we're just doing this to see that everything is working as expected now. Move this over. then we can make some changes and see how self-healing works. Okay, so that's just completed. If I go to my reports tab up here, this should load and hopefully it will tell me that the run that we've just done a few seconds ago has passed. Perfect. So we now have a test and it passes. But what would happen if our application changes and the locator that we're using to find one of those elements no longer works? Well, we can see that now. So I'm going to go back into our test and open up recorder mode. I'm not actually going to change our application under test. Instead, what I'm going to do is edit the locators in one of these elements to make them break. And we'll see how TestProject iterates through the rest of the locators to see if it can find one which now works. So if I move this over here, before I change any of the locators, I'm just going to get rid of this step here and this step here. These are where we're clicking into the elements, but we don't need to do that because we've got subsequent steps to enter text. Okay. Now I'm going to go into my email field and have a look at those selectors that we saw earlier. So we know these work because we've tested them. But if I was to change the first 3 locators by just adding a 1 to the end of each of these and saving that, I can now run this test and we should see something slightly different when we get to step 3 here. So if I run it all the way to the bottom, you can see that it's not quite putting the email in yet, and we've got this message down the bottom here telling us that the element for step 3 is missing. So what's happening at the moment is TestProject is iterating through those elements, through those locators to try and find one which works. And you can see that it has found one and it's completed the test. So we can see from here that TestProject has recorded that step slightly differently. We don't have the green as we see for past steps, nor do we have the red for a failed step. Instead, we have orange. And that means that this test has been self-healed. You see this little heart sign here. So if I go into the details here, we can see that TestProject has tried to find the element using the original locator. This is the one at the top of our list, which we changed. It wasn't able to find that. What it's done is it's iterated through the list and it's found the first element that works successfully, and which is this XPath element here, which was the 4th one on our list. So that's great. It's notified us that something's happened that wasn't expected, but it's clever enough to continue with the test without failing. Cool. So we've seen how it works when we're in recorder mode, but obviously you're not going to be running your tests in recorder mode all the time. So let's close this down and run it as we did before in Chrome. So this time we'll see what happens to that test. We're expecting the same results as we've just seen in recorder mode, but this time we want to see what happens in the reporting. So again, we see this test is slightly stalled where it's trying to find the locator that works for email. Once it's found one, it should be able to continue the test and register that user. You can see in recorder mode we don't have the message down the bottom. Okay, so that test has completed. So now we can have a look to see what happens when we go to the reports for that test. Just wait for the new report to load. Okay, you can see that it's actually registered as a pass here. So if I drill down into it, we can see that all the steps have passed, but step 3 has the little self-healing test icon here, and it tells us that step has been healed. So again, we can go in here, and once again it tells us that it's tried to use CSS selector 1, email 1, but it's failed. So it's iterated through and has successfully located that element using the locator here. Okay, so the great thing about self-healing tests is that you don't actually have to do anything. TestProject will take care of it all for you. It will find the locators and it will store them, and it will automatically iterate through those locators until it finds one which works. If none of them work, it will fail the test. So one other thing that TestProject does is it will actually go back and update your list of locators. So if I go back to my test now and find the element where the issue was and have a look at the element now, it's actually moved the successful locator to the top of our list and dropped down the ones which didn't work. So now if I run the test again, I'm not going to get the self-healing issue. It's just going to work with this XPath. Great. That's about it for this demo. I hope it was useful. If you have any questions, you can get in touch via Twitter at RyanTestStuff, and I'm also on LinkedIn. Thank you and happy testing.